A single blast would have been shocking. Two might have suggested a coordinated strike. But what unfolded over the city was something entirely different. Dozens of detonations erupting across the skyline like shards of fire falling from the clouds. What happened above the city wasn't a typical missile strike. It wasn't a single warhead slamming into the ground. What unfolded was something far more methodical and far more unsettling. Until recently, very few people realized that Iran possessed a weapon system like this direct. This is Locut Times. Today we're taking a closer look at what may have just shifted in this conflict and why defense analysts believe the situation has entered unfamiliar territory. Now let's start with the fundamentals, because the technology involved here can sound almost unreal if you're hearing about it for the first time. A cluster munition works very differently from a traditional explosive warhead. Normally, a missile strikes its target and detonates in one concentrated explosion. A cluster weapon operates on an entirely different principle. Imagine a missile rising high into the atmosphere. At a predetermined altitude, often thousands of feet above the ground, the warhead opens mid-air, almost like a capsule splitting apart. Instead of a single blast, it releases dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of smaller explosive devices known as submunitions. Each one is roughly the size of a beverage can, but each carries enough explosive force to cause deadly damage within its immediate radius. As they fall, these bomblets scatter across a wide area, sometimes covering several square kilometers. One missile launch can distribute explosive fragments over an entire section of a city. That's why they're known as cluster weapons. One delivery system, but many separate explosions. And the danger doesn't always end when the attack is over. A significant portion of these submunitions fail to detonate on impact. Instead, they remain hidden where they land, on roads, rooftops, fields, and playgrounds, sometimes for years. These dormant explosives are referred to as unexploded ordnance, or UXO. Across different conflicts, unexploded bomblets have continued to injure or kill civilians long after the fighting has ended, affecting communities in places such as Lebanon, Laos, and Ukraine. But the situation becomes even more concerning when you look at how these weapons are being delivered. Iran isn't relying on basic rockets fired randomly toward targets. The delivery platform being used is far more sophisticated. The system involves ballistic missiles, long-range weapons that travel at extreme speeds along high arcs through the upper atmosphere before descending toward their targets. Unlike older rocket systems, these missiles are capable of traveling vast distances and reaching Israel directly from Iranian territory. The crucial modification lies in the payload. Instead of carrying a single explosive warhead, these missiles have reportedly been equipped with cluster warheads designed to split apart during flight. At a specific altitude, estimated somewhere between roughly 500 and 1,000 meters above the ground, the warhead opens and releases a cloud of submunitions. That altitude isn't random. Military engineers calculate it carefully. If the warhead opens too high, wind currents can scatter the bomblets unpredictably. If it opens too low, the spread area becomes too small. The chosen altitude creates the largest possible coverage zone. The result is devastating in terms of area. Instead of one explosion at a single point, the attack produces dozens of detonations scattered across streets, buildings, and open spaces simultaneously. There's no clear center of impact. No obvious direction from which the danger comes. For those on the ground, the threat seems to arrive everywhere at once. Initial reports created confusion about whether people could see or hear the warheads separating in the sky. Some officials claimed the process would be almost impossible to detect. Yet eyewitness accounts tell a different story. Residents described hearing a chain of smaller explosions rather than a single blast. Rapid bursts echoing across neighborhoods, flashes appearing across the skyline in multiple places at once. For many witnesses, it felt less like a single attack and more like a storm sweeping through the city, an unpredictable series of impacts arriving from every direction. and that psychological dimension may be just as significant as the physical destruction. To understand why analysts consider this a major escalation, you have to look at Iran's broader military approach in recent years. Earlier in the conflict, much of the attention centered on drone warfare, particularly the Shahed drones. These drones are relatively inexpensive and slow-moving, but they are often deployed in large numbers. Because they cost far less than the interceptor missiles used to shoot them down, they place enormous financial and operational pressure on air defense systems. It's a classic example of asymmetric strategy, forcing an opponent to spend enormous resources countering relatively cheap weapons. Cluster-armed ballistic missiles introduce a different layer to that approach. While drone swarms aim to overwhelm air defenses through sheer volume, cluster warheads create challenges on the ground by spreading damage across wide areas. Even the most advanced missile defense systems are primarily designed to intercept individual incoming warheads. Once a warhead breaks apart and disperses dozens of smaller explosives in the air, the defensive equation becomes much more complicated. There's another dimension to this issue that often receives less attention. Cluster munitions are heavily restricted under international agreements. More than 100 countries have joined conventions prohibiting their use due to the long-term danger posed by unexploded submunitions. When these weapons affect civilian populations, many legal experts classify their use as a potential war crime. When you step back and view the situation as a whole, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Iran's strategy appears built around layered asymmetric tactics designed to challenge a militarily stronger opponent. First came waves of relatively inexpensive drones intended to test and strain defensive systems. Now, cluster-equipped ballistic missiles introduce wide-area effects that complicate protection efforts on the ground. Each component adds pressure in a different way: military, economic, and psychological. And that layered strategy may be the most significant factor of all. Because in asymmetric warfare, the most dangerous development is rarely the weapon you already understand. It's the one that appears next, before anyone is fully prepared for it.